Hey everybody, this is Gery Deer coming to you from the Whip Artistry Studio in Jamestown, Ohio. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of the whips in our collection here. Now, personally, I own about 60 whips. I kind of lost track. So if you're like I am and you've got some favorites, sometimes the other ones sort of get stuck in the bag and they don't come out that often. But here in the studio, we use just about everything that we have. But I do have a few pieces that don't come out very often, and I wanted to show you some of those today for the Bullwhip Museum. So I'm going to start with my favorite and probably the most asked about piece from my collection. Now, when you think of the word Zorro, the first thing that comes to mind typically is either Antonio Banderas or Douglas Fairbanks. And what happened in 1998 with the Mask of Zorro generated a new interest in Zorro and a new interest in whip work, just as Indiana Jones did. So one of the things I want to show you is a whip that was used in the film that not a lot of people know about. The first thing is, this is a duplicate and a copy or replica of the whip that was used by Sir Anthony Hopkins in the movie, and most people are used to seeing this one. It's got the silver band on it, it's got the heavy knot. This was Alex Green's design he used for many years, and it's actually one of those whips that people like to play with it because it's such a unique piece. It has a really long handle. It's a 12-plat kangaroo whip. You've probably seen this many, many times. But this isn't the whip I'm talking about from Zorro. That whip, there were a couple of them, different ones. I don't have the originals to that. What I do have is sort of a stunt whip, and I guess that's the best way to explain it. So this is a 6-foot David Morgan whip that was owned by Alex Green originally. And in the Mask of Zorro movie, they were about to shoot the mine scenes at the end, and they realized that there was no whip for a particular stunt that needed to be done. So in order to get that shot, they had to come up with another whip. And Alex had a brown 6-foot 12-plat, basically an Indy style whip. It has the shorter handle here, but no wrist loop. So it's got a flat butt on it. It's a 12-plat, typical Indiana Jones style whip. There's nothing special about it. It's got the herringbone and the regular braids, and it's just an ordinary whip. There was nothing really unusual, except the fact that it was brown. And as you know, you can't have a brown whip with Zorro. Zorro needs to have a black whip. It's even in one of the titles of one of the movies, Zorro's Black Whip. That's how it works. So they dyed it because Antonio Banderas used the whip. It was well broken in. It was Alex's. It didn't belong to the studio. And if you don't know who Alex Green is, go look him up. He's a good friend of a lot of us in the whip world. He was a good friend of mine. I miss him a lot. He passed away about 10 years ago now. But the things that he taught me about whip work and how this whip was chosen was really kind of fun, because Antonio liked this whip so well, they did dye it black and use it for the scene. It just kind of worked. So I'm going to show you some of the detail on the whip that's sort of unique to it. But I want to start out with the fall and the popper, because this is kind of one of the most unusual pieces of this. This whip is a two-bellied, double-bellied Indy style whip, as I mentioned, 12-plat. So it's pretty normal if you know anything about whips at all. But what's unusual is the way this popper is tied on. So I'm going to grab this piece of cardboard over here, and we're going to try to zoom in on this for you a little bit. So if you look really closely here, I'm going to bring two different falls and poppers. So the one on your left, is the replica Zorro whip. And you can see I've got a knot, an ordinary fall knot tied in this. And there are a couple of ways to tie a popper on. You know how that works. But what's interesting about this is that this is how we typically tie a popper on. But Alex didn't do it that way. Let me show you this one. So this is going to be very hard to see, but we're going to try to put in some close-ups of this. But this is a tiny little fall. I don't think it's more than, oh gosh, maybe a little over 1/4 of an inch wide. And at the very bottom down here, at where it ends, you have the knot, but the way this is done, there's a tiny little hole in the end of this fall, and the popper is fished through that hole and pulled through. It's really kind of interesting. I've not ever changed the popper on this whip. This is the popper that it came to me with. And when Alex gave me the whip, it had this already on it, and I don't use this whip. It stays in a display case most of the time, or it goes to charity events. This is an unusual piece because most of the time the fall knot is something that's tied around the whip, around the popper, or the popper's tied around the fall. Most people know how to put a fall on. This is an unusual piece. Now I'm going to get rid of this. Let's go back to more of the body of the whip. This fall is a typical white hide fall that's been dyed black, so there's nothing unusual about that. I think you can see that pretty well. It's got the typical hitch knot at the bottom, or the hitch to hold the fall on, and you can see it's got a little bit of conditioner coming through there where it doesn't get used much, and I don't wipe it that often, so you can see it there. But the other thing is, and this is going to be harder to see too, but if you look at the butt of the handle, you can see some of the brown when they dyed this by hand. So some of the brown has worn out, the black has worn out, and the brown has worn through, so you can see little pieces of it in there. But if it were laying in a pile with other whips, unless you knew some other details, which I'm not going to go into, there are other details about the whip that make it unique that really would identify it from a different one, but we have all those recorded. So for a museum piece, that's why we take so many measurements and so much care with this. But the whip, it's just a beautiful crack of this whip. And if you want to see it being used, you can go to YouTube. And I've had this whip on television myself. I used it with Steve Harvey on his show back in 2005, and then later in 2008 with Bonnie Hunt on her talk show. She actually used the whip, and Steve Harvey used the whip. So a couple of celebrities have used it. But I'm going to back up a second. So just before I got this from Alex, it was used for another very special movie, which some of you like and some of you don't. It was the Catwoman movie featuring Halle Berry, but it wasn't used in the film. This was actually Halle's training whip. So when they were trying to get the Catwoman whips finished, they weren't ready in time to get going with the training, and Alex already had this one, so it is as close to the Halle Berry whips as you're going to find. The difference between those is that it doesn't have this knot, and the herringbone goes all the way down. Instead of having the checkerboard on the handles like most Indiana Jones whips, it actually has the herring that goes all the way to the knot. So that's really the only difference between this and a Halle Berry Catwoman whip. But it was close enough that she could learn on it. So she taught, Alex taught her for the movie on this particular whip. Now later on, he also used it on a TV show called Peacemakers. So it was a USA sort of a CSI meets Gunsmoke kind of thing. If you watch Longmire, it's sort of laid out like that a little bit. But it was in one episode of that. And then it came to me right after Halle Berry was finished with it. So it is in our permanent collection here, and it stays in a display case. And I do take it to charity events and other things, and I will take it out and crack it once in a while. But we're very careful with it. It's one of those pieces that has a lot of history, and I am really fond of Zorro. It's how I started. So when Alex asked me to take care of this one, that was kind of a big deal to me that he thought I should have it. So it worked out for us very well. So now it stays as part of our collection, and it sits alongside my replica of this one. I do know that the original to this, the silver banded whip, was sold not too long ago. I believe Paul Nolan, Midwest Whips, had it, and he sold it to a collector. But this one isn't going anywhere, so it'll still be here. And we're going to come back in just a second. I'm going to show you a couple more from our collection, so don't go away. Hey, we're back. This is Gery Deer at the Whip Artistry Studio, and our second piece that we're going to show you in this video here is one of my personal pieces that I use for performance, and it was made by Paul Nolan at Midwest Whips, and it was custom built for me. I asked for a very specific whip, and Paul really came through for me. This whip is about 10 years old now. It is a white kangaroo hide. This is not painted. A lot of people see this whip. It's about 5.5 feet long, and it's a single belly, 12 plait whip. And if you can see there, it's got black and blue knots, because that is our studio colors. The Whip Artistry Studio colors are black and blue, so you see the checkerboard black and blue knots. And then it's herringbone all the way up the handle. It is not a checkerboard handle, and goes all the way up to the Spanish knot at the top. So this piece right here, also black and blue, and then it continues on, but it's hard to really show it, but this starts tapering down here at the base, at the end of the end of the thong, And at the end of that handle, it is continually narrowing all the way down. This is something I asked for because they work better that way. This is how I feel about it. But you can sort of see that it gets narrower all along this length, all the way up to the fall of the Spanish knot, and then around the rest of the whip. But a couple of interesting parts about this whip, apart from the fact that it's white and not painted, which most people do, is I use a multicolor popper on it just to add to it. Now I should say also this whip doesn't get used very often because of its white leather. If you use this on a regular basis, you would destroy it. It just couldn't handle it. And one of the reasons I wanted a white whip was because my very first whip was white. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and it's actually in one of the cases behind me here in the studio museum area. But it just had that piece, that look that I liked. Plus, when you're working on stages all the time, you want those white whips. When people see this from a distance, they think it's nylon, and it isn't. This is kangaroo hide. And Paul Nolan can tell you how he accomplished all of this. I'm not going to get into those details with you here, but just know this is one of the best, most accurate whips I've ever used. And I used it in a show called Whips and Wands for many years with a magician, and it was hanging on a tuxedo. But now someone would say, well, Gery, that's a really nice whip. How did you keep it so clean? Well, that's because it doesn't get used very much. It has a stunt double. So I'm going to introduce you to this whip's stunt double right now. So along with this whip, I asked Paul to make me one that was a little more durable, that we could paint to look like that one. And this is what we came up with. It's roughly the same length, but this whip has a similar taper from the handle, the handle butt all the way out. It's got a similar taper to the other one, but it's an 8-plat single belly whip. And it's 8-plat because the 8-plat whip can take a lot more abuse than a 12-plat. The finer those strands are, the less they can handle, especially if you're outside doing shows. And one of the first performances this got used in was a rodeo. So I was out in dirt, muck, it was pretty terrible. But we painted just from the handle, from this Spanish knot all the way out, we painted the whip with craft paint. It's designed for leather. And that way the whip showed up the way the white leather would have. But I wanted to keep the functionality. People would say, well, why don't you just use a nylon whip in place of that? Even the nylon whips get dirty. So this is one of those pieces that we really wanted to pay attention to how it was built. And the black, people say, why did you dye the knot black here? Well, the knot, the Spanish knot is dyed black so that you can see an easy transition on film, and from a distance from an audience, you can see a real easy transition where that whip starts. I don't care where they see the handle. So the whip was originally brown, just like this handle is. And you can see also there's a piece of leather missing at the butt. Came off years and years ago, and I don't want to put it back. I just kind of like the end of the nail. If you know how these are made, there's a steel spike in there, and that's the head of the nail sticking out. But these two whips have really served me well over the years. Their tapers, the interior construction, it proved to me that I don't really see a whole lot of difference between an 8 and a 12 as far as functionality goes, but this whip is held up a lot better from just being used. As you can see, now it may be difficult to see on camera, but the leather is in incredibly good condition. And this whip gets used a lot. I mean, this is my go-to for shows, for any kind of performance, and any kind of weather, really. I don't really pull the punches. I don't like nylon whips. So the paracord whips don't do like I want them to do a lot of times. So I have some, but this is my go-to. The other thing is the popper tie. And this is not anything too fancy, but these are both white hide falls. I can show you that. That's not really anything to write hold my mouth. Those are normal. But the popper here, I will always use a light colored popper, typically white. And then you've got the fall knot, the popper is tied around the end of the fall instead of the fall being tied around the popper, because it just keeps that streamlined flow. You don't have that big clunky knot at the end of that. And I have the same thing here with the white one. It's very much the same kind of a situation there. So the poppers that I use are basically upholstery thread. They need to be really loud and very, very precise. So I don't really use the baling twine type or the poly type on whips like this. Also, they're a little too heavy. Oh, I should point that out too. So this fall on the Stunt whip, here's the Stunt whip again, this fall is much heavier. So if you look at the thickness coming off of the hitch here, where the fall hitches, this one is markedly thicker than this one. It's a much heavier fall. And as it goes down, this becomes very, very thin. Here, you can see how tiny that is compared to the heavier one on the Stunt whip, because the Stunt whip, again, has to take a lot of abuse. It's going to be out in the weather. It's going to be out wherever I am working. This is probably the whip I do the most targets with, and it takes a lot of abuse. So I want to make sure that the fall is heavy enough. Now, neither of these whips have ever had the falls changed, and that's because partly the way I take care of them, but also it's a testimony to the white hide. I think that this particular batch of white hide we had that Paul made these out of was just particularly good. So I haven't had to do a lot with it. You can see that if you look at it closely, which you may not be able to see from the camera angle, but it's pretty beat up. I mean, it gets used a lot. So it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's well kept and well taken care of. Also, I should point out the handle length on these is about 10 inches. So you have, it's not an Indiana Jones whip. It's more like an Australian bull whip. So it has the longer handle, and that goes to its precision. What I told Paul when I sort of designed these things in my head was, I wanted it to be super precise. I'm taking numbers off of playing cards with these. So whoever my target holder is, I want to make sure that is always a safe thing to do, that I have 2 or 3 inches of dead space where I can be that precise and be one way or the other, not even be close to hurting that person. So it's really important that this work very well, that these transitions hold up. Now, I should point out also that these whips would not be very good for multiple cracking, for things like volleys and other types of motion where the whip has to oscillate in some way back and forth. If you were having to do this with it, this transition is in really, really good condition because I don't do that with these whips. Because of the single belly, and Paul does amazing work, don't get me wrong, it has nothing to do with the whip makers at all. But if this was worn like that, this would break down much, much faster. So everybody talks about David Morgan's whips, and maybe on a subsequent, you can have a look at any David Morgan whip. A lot of them are broken down right through here, even the Indiana Jones whips from the films, because they just didn't bulk this up very well. Paul does a particularly good job on the inside of these, and a lot of whip makers do too, but if they weren't, it would break down in a hurry. And even if, no matter how good you are, even if you were that good at it and you made a great transition, this is going to break down because there's a single belly in there. It's very narrow. It's not built to take that kind of punishment. So that's the reason they're in such good condition after 10 years or so. So they are a unique pair, because this is my idea of a paired match of whips, because it's really one doing one job to protect the other. So I can still use this nice white one indoors on carpeted stages and other areas where it's a nice space, and I've got a duplicate of it to work out in the weather and everything. So that's our 2, or rather 3 whips we wanted to show you today from the Whip Artistry Studio. And please come back and have more look around the Bullwhip Museum. And thank you again to Robert Dante and his crew for allowing us this time. Again, this is Gery Deer with the Whip Artistry Studio. We'll see you out there in the whip world.